we're talking about the power of personal projects and mainly focusing on how to choose photo stories that matter to you. And obviously that's something that I've talked about with all of you, really, about trying to choose stories that have meaning and importance to you, because I think that's one of the most important things that you can do when you're trying to take that step from moving on from. I just heard a motorbike speeding away. Did anybody else hear that?
Yeah, I heard that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fine, though. It's fine.
That was someone leaving the webinar.
You're in Beijing, right?
That wasn't a sound effect that I inserted.
You're in Beijing right now, John, right?
I am in Beijing, yeah.
So I would expect noises like that.
Well, I'm quite high up in an apartment complex, so I'm quite far away from the street, so it definitely wasn't mine. It might be John.
I think it's my motorbike on my street because a couple have gone by.
Oh, really?
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine. It's absolutely fine. Okay, so in terms of making the decision about choosing a personal project, because like I said, most of you approached me with being at the stage of being content with making single images. All of you are, good photographers already, and you could make good single images. And again, I've spoken with many of you about this, that most amateur photographers get to that point where they can make single images, but very few amateur photographers actually make that next step, which is to make photo stories. And actually taking that next step of making photo stories is the next step in terms of improving your image making. Because when you start to work on stories, single images take on a different meaning. Because when you start to put them together, you find that photography has a new power to go beyond just a single image, to start telling stories with those photos. So when I encourage people to choose photo stories, I try to focus on these 4 things. And I think these 4 things are like the key factors that you should think about when you're thinking about what stories to choose. And I'm going to, reference something that Jim and I talked about just a week or 2 ago. And Jim sent me through a very long list of story ideas that he had, maybe 6 or 7. Do you remember that, Jim?
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, this is normally the opposite of what I get. Normally people are struggling to come up with ideas, but Jim had come up with lots and lots of different ideas. So what I tried to do was to try to give Jim a little bit of a criteria to try to select which stories were doable, which ones were important to him, so that it was like a little checklist. And we kind of framed it in terms of, well, let's give each project kind of like a score in a way, so that you can prioritize which project is A, the most important, or B, which is most doable in terms of access and whether it's close to you. And so I think this little checklist is quite important for all of you when you're thinking about which stories that you want to choose and select. And so I've just kept it really, really simple into these 4 points. So the first one is to find a meaningful story. And when I say meaningful story, first, it's got to be meaningful to you on a personal level, because I think stories that resonate with you as a person are the kind of stories that you're going to stick with, that you're going to dedicate yourself to. They're the kind of stories that you're going to keep doing, even when most other photographers would have given up on them, because they mean something to you personally, having a connection to maybe your personality, maybe something in your personal life, or maybe just your general interests in terms of the subject matters that you like to cover as a photographer. So the first one is finding something that a subject matters that's really meaningful to you. The second and third one kind of work together. Number 2, proximity. By proximity, I mean finding something that is literally physically close to where you live or work. So you can have a great idea for a story, but if it's halfway across the country, then it's not going to be something that you're going to be able to work on very easily. And with personal projects, it's much better to have them close by so that you are able to easily visit the place, to literally get to it, to be able to photograph it. Because the easier it is to get to, the easier it is for you to spend more time working on that story, just because it's literally closer to you. And then that feeds into number 3, which is access. And that's all about how easy is it to get into that community that you've chosen to focus on, or how easy is it to meet and photograph that person that you might be telling a story about. So what's your access? Is it a friend? Is it a family member that you're photographing? Is it a community that you maybe live in that you could get access to? Is it a community that maybe you need permission to get access to, and perhaps you have to work on getting that permission? All of these things kind of feed into whether you get good access, because if you don't have access to the community that you want to photograph, then that story is never going to happen. So access is obviously very, very important. And then the final one that I think is really important is determining what your goal is with your personal project. Now, with all of you, each of you have different goals. Anne recently worked on a small book project during our mentorship. Dante is working on a small magazine. With Francis, we're working on refining his website, on editing his galleries, giving his work a bit more of a distinct presence online. So each of you have started to think about these projects in terms of, where am I going with this? I'm not just photographing randomly. I'm actually working towards some kind of goal. Now, that goal may change as the project develops, but having that goal of maybe publishing something for you personally, maybe working towards a local exhibition, or maybe refining something just for your website, or even having bigger goals of trying to pitch it to a magazine to get published. Having that goal will help you shape your project and will help give you something to aim for. And even if that goal changes, it's okay. But just having that goal with that purpose helps give your project that momentum. And sometimes during the project, as you do it, sometimes you need that little bit of motivation and boost, and you remember the goal that you're aiming for, and you remember the steps that you've already taken to get there, or to get to where you are and where you need to keep going with your project. So you're aiming for that goal. So those are the first four factors that I think are the most important. Does anyone have any questions about those for now, before I go on to the next part, where I'm going to talk about one of the projects that I chose early on in my career and the reasons why I chose those projects?
Sure.
Anne,
I've got a question about access.
Sure.
In terms of if the project that you want to do isn't friends, family, how do you know what to say, to ask,
Mm-hmm.
and how do you know who's the right person to email, contact, have a face-to-face with? You kind of must have to do a little bit of research first. I've got nothing in mind like this. All my projects I've got access to. But it just occurred to me, if I wanted to, I don't know, because I haven't got a project in mind where I don't have access. But what do you do as a professional? Because obviously you're not doing projects on local and with people you know all the time. So how do you find the right person to get permissions from?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, as a professional photographer, we're discouraged from ever photographing people who we know or are connected to. As journalists, if a journalist was working on a story, they're discouraged from having direct relations with their subject. So you have to go out into the world to find those. So in my case, and actually that's a really good segue for the story that I was going to show you. So in my case, what I try to do is if I have a story or community that I want to focus on, like you said, research is really, really important. So I will go online, I will maybe speak to other people who I might know who have some kind of connection to that community. And what I'm trying to do during that research is, like you said, I'm trying to identify who is the right person that I need to approach to get access to that community that I want to photograph. And the slides that you see up on the screen at the moment are from a story that I did in the first year after I came to Beijing. So this is nearly 20 years ago, maybe about 16 now, I suppose. But this was a story that I wanted to do. I stumbled across this story when I was reading one of the expat magazines. It was like a Time Out magazine in Beijing. And I read this little story about this orphanage outside of Beijing, which had been set up by this French couple. And they looked after orphans, specifically orphans that were visually impaired. And I just thought this was like a really touching, fascinating story. So I thought it would also make a really interesting photo story, but obviously I couldn't just walk up to this place and introduce myself. I had to first do the research, as much research as I could about the orphanage, about the people who work there, and then try to obviously find phone numbers, find email addresses. And once I was confident that I'd found the right people, then I would approach them. But obviously I would approach them as a professional photographer / journalist. So I'd write to them and say, hi, my name is Sean Gallagher. I'm a professional photographer. Here's a link to my website. I read about your story from the Time Out magazine, and I think it's a really interesting story looking at social issues in China, and you're a unique couple. And I'd really like to come along, meet you, show you some of my work, and discuss with you the idea about making a photo essay about what you're doing. And so for that story, that's exactly what I did. I found the email addresses of the couple who actually run the orphanage, and I emailed them with pretty much that exact introduction, and they said yes. And so that gave me that access. Now, the orphanage was about an hour's bus ride away from Beijing. So every weekend, I would take the bus out to the orphanage and make pictures during the day and then come back to the city. And obviously, that first time that I went, they didn't know me. I didn't know them. So perhaps they were slightly suspicious. But obviously, during that first meeting, you try to break the ice. You try to tell them your intentions. You try to communicate your good intentions. And I showed them my work. I showed them my portfolio. They could see that I was a serious photographer, and they could see some of my other photos and the way that I photographed. And then that convinced them that I wasn't a threat, that I was there to do positive work about what they were doing. And then from that first visit, I actually went back. I built some trust up, and I went back again. And then after a while, they probably thought, well, this guy's crazy enough to keep coming back and keep photographing and keep spending time with us. And slowly over time, over a couple of months, I'd gathered enough work to make a story about the life of the orphans at this orphanage and the couple who ran it as well. And eventually the story was published on the BBC website as a little photo essay, just showing the daily life of this orphanage and the really interesting work that they were doing. But, going back to your point, it all came down to research. And luckily now, with everything being online, you can do that research and you can really dive in to an organization. And then it's a case of, I always start at the top, go as high as you can, because, the people at the top make the decisions. and try to identify who is at the top, and then email them with your plan, what you want to do, why you want to do it, and hopefully, you know, they say yes. I mean, ideally, you want to meet someone face to face first, so that you can pitch yourself face to face. But that's not always ideal. I always think the best is face to face. The second is by telephone, so voice call, and then the third, the worst, is via email. But sometimes it depends on the situation.